The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
On behalf of RBCS and Software Test Professionals, welcome to the first webinar of 2014 on 10 bugs that shook the world. I am Rex Black, president of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients that range from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, we have delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. We have a team of international consultants that deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I'm the author of 12 books on software testing, including the bestseller, Managing the Testing Process. We are presenting this webinar in partnership with Software Test Professionals. Check out their website, www.softwaretestpro.com. Before we start the presentation, a couple housekeeping notes. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to submit them throughout the presentation via your webinar interface, but please note that they are answered only at the end. You do not need to ask for presentation copies. The presentation is on the web at rbcs-us.com. Navigate to the resource tab, upper middle, and from there to the basic library. By attending this webinar, you are automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing. Check your email over the next couple days and watch the spam filter. Hope you enjoyed this free webinar from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not just for profit company. So the title for this was adapted or ripped off, if you prefer, from John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, which is his eyewitness description of the communist revolution in October 1917 in Russia. So I thought, well, that's a good takeoff. So we can discuss whether hardware and software bugs have had as much impact on the world yet as the Russian Communist Revolution. Of course, the Russian Communist Revolution brought us an entire short century, if you will, from 1917 to 1991 of pretty concentrated chaos and conflict as the ideologies of capitalism and communism battled it out. Maybe software and hardware bugs haven't been quite that disruptive, and certainly that haven't threatened to blow up the world yet. But bugs have created a lot of problems. People have been injured and killed. Lots of money has been lost. National security has been degraded in some cases by bugs. So out of the hundreds of examples of bugs and how bugs have negatively affected people, I decided to pick 10 that would be particularly important, though you'll see that one of them is maybe only important to me, but it was important. So the first bug I want to talk about is one that happened on a project. We were doing testing on this project for our client. It was a complex system of systems, and one of these systems was an interactive voice response server. If you're not familiar with what those are, basically any time that you're interacting with a phone, you're like calling tech support or something like that, and you're navigating through the menus, that's the interactive voice response server piece. And the developers who were creating that particular subsystem, they decided that the way they were going to do their performance testing of it was to write this load generator that would run on half of the telephony cards. There were about 1,000 of them. And then the software under test would run on the other half of the telephony cards, and they'd loop them back, use loopback cables to attach them, and they basically drive load into half of the cards. Now, the main issue with this is that there was no attention paid to the issue of how much load do the load generators themselves put on the system compared to the load that is put on the system by the software under test. And that can't just be a thumbnail kind of estimate. You really have to know, CPU, disk throughput, memory, all those kind of things. So any one of those can be a bottleneck. So I explained on numerous occasions to project management and to these developers that what they were doing was not a valid way of doing a performance test. It was unrealistic, and they basically said, shut up and mind your own business. And I did, but my business was doing a realistic test. So when we got it, we didn't run the generator on the load generator on the system under test. We ran it on a separate load generating box. We were careful to make sure that the load generators did not load that box very heavily. We wanted to make sure that there wasn't any sort of bottlenecking of the load coming out of the load generator that would make it appear to be realistic load generation from the load generator side, but actually what would be perceived by the system under test would be less than that. So we're sure we had plenty of resource on the load generator side to support the load generators. We loaded all 1,000 telephony ports and started cranking them up 10% at a time, stepping up to ultimately reaching the full, trying to reach the full load of 100%. All the ports loaded. Didn't get there. Somewhere a little above 50% load. Surprise, surprise. 50% was what they had tested before. We ran into a resource bottleneck, and the application crashed when we tried to push it beyond that. So the right thing to do would have been to go, oh boy, we've got some serious design issues. We need to address that. But what ended up happening was what is the usual thing that's done in this case, which is throw hardware at the problem. So they did. They threw hardware at the problem, and what happened was that they would figure out where the bottleneck was. They'd throw hardware at that bottleneck, and then boom, turn around, and we'd step up the load a little bit and run into the next one. They're never able to get the thing completely resolved by throwing extra hardware at it, because there was just limits about how much hardware could be thrown into the box. It was already pretty well populated with hardware the way that thing was, and it was expensive. So ultimately, the box was not able to perform to the required level of load, which ended up undermining the business case, and the project, having stumbled on for months and months after its planned project end date, was basically canceled or repurposed in some way, but millions of dollars were lost, and it was an IT disaster. I'd love to say that was the only one of those I've ever seen, but no. One of the interesting things about being a consultant is you sometimes get called in after there's been a mess made, try to take a look around and see what can be done, salvage the mess, if anything. So I got a call from a client once down in Australasia, being Australia, New Zealand, and they were a bank, but they had an insurance branch, and in that insurance branch, they had basically grown this thing by mergers, and so they bought, and then dozens of different companies, and each of which had their own legacy applications that were managing the policies that they had, and this, of course, became an IT nightmare. So they had the good thought of, well, let's just create a single application that can manage all of the policies. All right, good idea. But what happened was that when they went through this process of selecting which would be sort of the base application, because what they decided to do was pick the application that they thought that was the best and use that as the basis of the design for the successor. And what ended up happening was that the two people who were tasked with designing this underlying database really didn't know what they were doing. They did not understand anything about relational database design. They wouldn't have known normalized versus denormalized tables to, if they'd been slapped upside the face with them. They had really no clue. They did have very large egos, and they refused to listen to anybody who was telling them, that's not going to scale. So I get there, they're 3 years into this, and there's all sorts of problems that are happening, and what's clear is that the database as designed is not going to scale, and a complete redesign of the database at that point would have pretty much pulled down the whole house of cards, as it were. I mean, the way the application was built, all the rest of the architecture was sort of predicated on the data model, so it was very brittle. And they would have had to really go back almost to square one and start over. Very little of the existing code would have been salvageable had they done that. So what ended up happening was the project was canceled, and a huge amount of money lost, tens of millions of dollars. And of course, there were significant opportunity costs because there were a lot of people on this project who could have been doing something productive rather than working on a totally failed project. And what's sad is this was, as with the previous example, a fully avoidable scenario. There was no reason why this had to happen. Had there been proper design reviews done, they would have, database design reviews that is, they would have found these problems. Okay, now here's another very expensive bug. Is the TJ Maxx chain of stores in North America. TJ Maxx used wireless routers that were set up using relatively weak encryption. And they also were not managing the collected data properly on the back end. So the routers are being used within the store to transmit data from the point of sale systems to the servers, and they were weak and hackable. And then within the servers as well, the data was not properly managed. So 47 million customer records were leaked out to hackers who had basically figured out how to park in the parking lot close enough to the wireless access points and gain access to them and use that to not only skim off incoming information but also get into the database itself. This is the to this point, largest leak of personal information that has occurred. Now, there's something going on with Target here in North America right now, the Target chain of stores, which may end up eclipsing this over time once the full scale of it is known. That is not the situation with Target, by the way, is not as different as one might hope. It's not like the Target folks learned the lesson of this TJ Maxx debacle, because that has to do with data mismanagement again on the back end. Now, the immediate damage was $1 million in merchandise that were fraudulently purchased. But the longer-term, more insidious problem was that the credit card information was posted on the internet and was available for people to buy. And so, who knows ultimately what the total losses were, what the total damage was. Now, worse yet, this was a known problem. They had had a security test, and the weakness of the routers in terms of their encryption relative to best practices at that point, and the data management had all been pointed out to management, and of course there would have been costs because they would have had to swap out the routers that they had, and that would have been expensive. And so they said, well, we don't want to do that because after all, the payment card industry data security standard doesn't require us to do that yet. So we're just going to do the minimum required by the PCI DSS, and once the PCI DSS is changed, then we'll upgrade. And by that time, the horse was already out of the barn, as the saying goes. So this is an interesting example of a standard that was intended to result in higher security actually being used as a pretext for retaining an insecure configuration. Now, this is the one that really doesn't meet my rule. My rule for selecting bugs here was that either that somebody had to die or $1 million had to be lost, or both. This doesn't qualify. Thankfully, nobody died, and it didn't cost anybody $1 million. But it's still an interesting example of how software's ubiquity can create some really serious headaches and ones that would be very difficult to deal with. So we had a Ford Expedition at one point, and I didn't drive it much. It was mostly my wife would drive it with family in it, sometimes friends of the family, because one of the reasons you have an Expedition is to not only cart around your own kids, but miscellaneous other kids. They're going to parties and so forth. So this is sort of like a, mini school bus kind of thing in a lot of ways. Well, you don't want that to have significant problems, and this thing did. And the problem was that at some point, I think within a year of buying this thing, and we bought it, by the way, brand new, so it wasn't that somebody had damaged this thing and then shucked it off on an unsuspecting car dealer who sold it to us. So this was bought brand new. And what started happening was that as you would be driving, the engine would just stop, as if you had turned the key off. Now, fortunately, it was a automatic transmission, so the consequences of that would not be as serious as they would be if that happened with a manual transmission, where your rear wheels will lock up. But still, it's a very difficult situation. You get total loss of power steering, power brakes, and this is a large and relatively unwieldy vehicle in a lot of ways. And this didn't just happen on side streets at low speeds. This happened at 70 miles an hour on highways where there isn't really a safe place to leave the roadway. The vehicle was brought to the Ford dealership numerous occasions to try to get them to fix the problem. They were not able to replicate it. They would try various sort of Hail Mary type of things, putting updates in place and so forth. Never fixed the problem. At which point, through one particularly nasty incident involving a stall on the highway, and Laurel and the girls standing on the side of the highway basically trying to wait for the tow truck to come along, she threatened to sue under Texas's Lemon Law. Now, interestingly enough, the attorneys that she consulted with said, you'd forget it, you're never going to win, you'll never prevail. But they didn't really know who they were up against, and especially after that incident on the highway, and the thought of young children being paraded around in front of a jury, I think they decided to make the best of it, and they gave her a new one, brand new. Tried to charge for it, and were met by, I think, incredulity would be a gentle way of describing the response. Anyway, they gave us a new one, and that one actually worked properly all the way until the engine developed a problem. But that's a whole other story. That was not software; that was purely mechanical. But this just illustrates the type of difficulties that can occur when you have a mechanically controlled safety critical system, and certainly a vehicle is a safety critical system. Mechanically controlled software controlled safety critical system that develops an intermittent failure, that could be hardware, it could be software, it could be wiring, it could be any number of things. Now, number 6 is the flash crash of 2010. Now, what happened here is very interesting. There are these high-frequency trading systems that take advantage of small discrepancies between bid and ask prices in pools of shares that are owned around the market. And these differences are very small, but if you do enough of them fast enough, you can make money. That's a feature. Unfortunately, that same feature also results in a bug, if you will, or a failure, because it means that it will chase differences in these bid and ask prices. That's what it's supposed to do. That's its job. And as long as the market's behaving normally and it's relatively flat, then no problem. But as soon as the market starts to go down, it's basically piling on and chasing the market down, pushing the market down. So that resulted in the second largest point swing in history. and the biggest one-day point drop so far in history. Now, interestingly enough, what happened was that you have these circuit breakers, these automatic trade stopping limits that kick in at a certain point for really pretty much exactly this reason, and also to deal with panic, human panic. And the idea is to sort of provide a cooling off period. In this case, it's cooling off not just the humans, but it's also cooling off the computers. So in the case of, in the space of about 15 seconds, all of this transpired, as you can see from the graph here on the screen. And it just bam, all of a sudden, a little after 2 o'clock, market just collapsed. The brakes kick in, market's brought back up, boom, recovers more or less to where it had been before, within 200 points. Obviously a very disquieting event. Nobody knew what was going on at first, and it was only after people kind of looked at it that they maybe got a little more comfortable with, okay, kind of understand what happened here. The thing is that it's a bug and it's a feature. The underlying defects, if you will, are not fixed, and they might not even be fixable. It might not be possible to write high-speed trading, high-frequency trading systems like these that would do what they're supposed to do and yet recognize when one of these death spirals had occurred. It's almost that they just have to rely on the circuit breakers in the stock market to turn it off. Obviously, that's costly, and there are social costs associated with that, externalities which are not being borne by the high-frequency traders themselves. Something not entirely dissimilar happened with a company called Knight Capital, and that cost almost $500 million in losses. And obviously, there were losses associated with this flash crash, because you can see that the market did lose 200 points, and that's real money when you're talking about any sort of volume of trading, and it was for no real reason. And again, there's no fix to this. Forbes reported mid last year, late last year, that this could easily happen again. The automated detection mechanisms are a little better, so it might not be as big of a crash before the brakes kicked on, but it could still happen. Now we have something which might be hardware, might be software, might be a little bit of both. So Boeing announced that it was going to build this new airliner called the Dreamliner. Now, the dream was really for the airlines more than anything else. The dream being that these things are made of these composite materials, and they have all these advanced software controls on them, and they're very fuel efficient. And the idea was that they would allow the airlines to move people around at a much lower number of gallons, liters, whatever you want, of jet fuel per passenger per kilometer, mile, however you want to measure it. And that's the major cost for airlines, is fuel, as you might expect. So this was something that the airlines were very keen on. Now, the things did not go well. The development it suffered many delays. And of course, airlines expect this, because this always happens with airplanes. They're never delivered on time. Trouble really got out of hand, though, when shortly after delivery, there were a number of incidents where lithium-ion batteries either caught fire or failed in very hazardous ways. And after one particularly notorious incident where I believe it was a ANA or Japan Airlines 787, thankfully unoccupied, caught fire at Logan Airport, and didn't do major damage to the plane, but still, anytime you have a fire in an airplane, this is an exceptionally serious kind of situation, because it's not like having a fire in a house. Fire in a house is bad enough, but when you talk about these airplanes and their, what they are inside, it's very easy for them to catch fire. And the seats are flammable. There's plastics in there, and then they can turn into raging infernos pretty quickly. And then, of course, you have the matter of all the massive amounts of jet fuel that would potentially explode. So saying, minor fire, there just is no such thing as a minor fire on an airplane. The planes were all grounded while they're trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And meanwhile, the airplanes are sitting on the ground, and they're not appreciating, they're depreciating as they're sitting there. An airplane is a very expensive thing. If you as an airline are not realizing revenue on that plane on a daily basis, your return on equity just really goes downhill very, very fast. So it costs tremendous amounts of money, and the airlines lost millions during this grounding period. Internet sources are not entirely clear on what the ultimate cause was, whether it was hardware, software, a little bit of both. National Transportation Safety Board said, testing should have been better. So that's probably true. And you can understand how, since there had been a series of delays along the course of developing this thing, there was probably tremendous pressure on the testers to clear the testing done, or at least to shut up and get out of the way. And that's probably not a prescription for good outcomes when you are dealing with a large, complex, safety-critical system, which is, of course, what an airplane is. Speaking of lithium-ion batteries, there was an incident where some Sony lithium-ion batteries, because of a manufacturing defect, which resulted in loose iron shavings or metal shavings of some kind or another, causing shorts. And these shorts would result in the batteries either getting very hot or actually catching on fire. Apple and Dell were the two manufacturers that had bought these batteries. And so there was a recall that was issued because the batteries are dangerous. You can see what's happening here with this laptop on fire. Now, this is in a hotel conference room, and this is a containable situation here, but imagine that happening in an overhead container on an airplane in the sky, or worse yet, in the cargo hold of an airplane in the sky, or even in a cabin in a cruise ship or something like that, where a fire can be a fairly serious thing if it were to break out. So it's a very hazardous situation. Thank God nobody ended up being killed, but at least approximately 6 million bad batteries were floating around in circulation. Now, this really tells the story of testing having interesting and serious ramifications. Dell set up a special server, which of course you would need because you're going to recall millions of things. You can't just use the standard return process. The standard return process is designed for maybe 100 or so returns a day, and this was not going to be anything like that. So they set up a separate server, and they had us come in, my associates and I come in and test it, and we found a bunch of bugs, and we fixed the bugs, and it was sort of a heroic weekend of getting it fixed, but it was actually ready to go, and we were informed by our client, the vendor who had created this website, that it all went very well, and we also know that objectively because there were no reports of problems with the Dell recall. Now, the Apple side, not exactly the same situation. They apparently either didn't adequately test their servers, or they tried to do it on the same servers that were hosting their standard replacement policies, and I don't know. It's hard to say because they didn't hire me, and if they did hire anybody, that anybody isn't talking about what they saw during the testing of those systems. But it was widely reported in the press that the Apple recall server was just a disaster and not not working in any sort of meaningful way, huge delays. And meanwhile, people are walking around with almost 2 million dangerous batteries in their systems. It was that or stop using them. And you know, that's just simply not a possibility. And it's not like you can go into a Radio Shack and buy a replacement battery for these things. The only place you can usually get a proper replacement battery for your laptop is the vendor itself. So people were forced to continue to use these things while they were waiting for Apple to get their act together. And, you know, not exactly a shining achievement. Sony was a big loser here, losing somewhere, it's reported, of $100 million. That's Forbes, I believe, was my source on that. $100 million. So, you know, that's a lot of money burning batteries. But you think, you know, 6 million burning batteries, you know, so, and it does kind of make sense, because that's not, you know, that's $15 per battery, so that's actually not so bad. All right, now this is a really tragic one. I've been fortunate to have spent a lot of time in a lot of beautiful places. One of those beautiful places is Rio de Janeiro, which is certainly a spectacularly beautiful city, especially given its natural setting. Another one of those beautiful places is Paris, which I just was at just a few days ago. So Air France Flight 447, sometime in 2009, is flying from Rio to Paris, and you know, it's being managed by air traffic control. You might not be aware of this if you don't travel as much as I do, but there's pretty much at all times they're in touch with air traffic controllers on their progress. At one point, it just fell out of the sky. Nobody knew what had happened. They knew where it was. They knew where it fell out of the sky because they knew where they had lost track of it, but they didn't know what had happened. Other than that, you know, it had fallen out of the sky. Now, eventually, they got lucky, managed to recover the so-called black boxes, which were under a huge amount of water, and brought them up, and it turns out that the plane had stalled, which means that the lift is insufficient to counter gravity, basically, that the force of gravity pulling the plane down is not equalized by the gravity pushing it up to the, now that's going to be true anytime that you're in a descent, but in this case, this is a complete loss of lift. That's basically that there's the air going over the wings is not going fast enough. So it fell out of the sky, 38,000 feet. And it took 5 minutes. And when it hit the ocean, it was going 120 miles an hour, and everybody died. Apparently on impact, though. Probably hard to know for sure. Some of them may have drowned as the thing sank. Some of them may have tried to get loose or to get out of their seats, but where would they have to go, and how would they get any kind of inflatable raft going? Now, you know, just to reflect on that for a moment, that process of falling, the thing falling out of the sky, 5 minutes, the kind of hell and terror associated with that is unreal. Multiply that by 228, you know, it is a incredibly horrible incident. And what caused this? A $3,500 piece of equipment, a Pitot Tube, which you see here sticking out of the side of an Airbus, which is what this was, Airbus 340, I believe. And what happened was it got ice in it. It got ice in it because they were in a thunderstorm, and they were at high altitude, and water contacts metal that's well below freezing. It freezes, and so that causes the thing to send incorrect data, because the way that the Pitot Tube works is it's basically there's a vacuum being created by the flow of air over this thing, and if there's a ice crystals or ice cube basically blocking the thing, and what it's reading is not correct. So the Pitot Tube freezes. The data that's now going to the autopilot is incorrect because it's reading an improper airspeed. The computer, which is doing the autopilot, gets confused and basically says, I don't know what to do here, so I'm going to turn off. And meanwhile, these guys are flying through a thunderstorm, and the second string pilot is the one who's in the cockpit because the first string pilot is taking a rest. And so the pilot gets the blame in this story, in the official story of the investigators' reports. The pilot did the wrong thing, thought that the plane was slowing, and thought that it was descending, and pulled it up, and when pulling the nose up, managed to reduce the speed enough that it stalled. And at that point, according to the French government, they're basically their version of the National Transportation Safety Board. Once the stall had happened, as maybe a military pilot could have pulled it out of the stall, but the average pilot, no. Now, what's very sad about this is that this was a known problem with these Pitot tubes, and they were being replaced at the time with ones that had warmers in them that would be more effective at preventing this kind of failure. But tragically for the passengers on this flight, theirs was not one of the planes that had been retrofitted at that time, and they all died. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here because I think people might question my classifying these two incidents as bugs, but there's a method to my madness here. Hear me out. So, we have Bradley Manning, Private Bradley Manning, in a facility in Iraq, and we have Edward Snowden in a facility in Hawaii, and both of these two fellows were able to access individually, without any sort of check and balance on their abilities to do this, massive amounts of highly classified data, which they then distributed. Private Manning to Julian Assange's organization WikiLeaks, and Snowden to the Guardian newspaper. And this information proceeded to leak out into the public and was tremendously damaging to the, like in the Manning case, it was a huge black eye to the entire war in Iraq, as if the war in Iraq needed any further black eyes. At that point, it was a universally, well, maybe not universally, but widely disliked enterprise at that point. And Snowden, his ongoing leaks have at this point netted the public spectacle of the Director of National Intelligence, a gentleman named Clapper, perjuring himself in front of the United States Senate, giving an answer that he subsequently described as the least untruthful answer I could give, which try using that defense if you're ever accused of perjury and see where that gets you. Now, the reason I'm calling these things bugs is obviously there's a huge human component here, because without Manning and Snowden having their agendas, none of this would have happened. But I mean, that's what security is for. Security is for making sure that the way that systems work is such that an individual's opinion about how they should work does not override what's going on with them. And it is possible to do that. For example, a single individual cannot launch a nuclear missile. There are checks and balances on that, such that there have to be multiple people involved in the chain before that happens. And the same can be done with data security. The trouble is that in order to make sure that those kinds of systems work for data security, you need to be able to do penetration testing to make sure that they're set up right. And interestingly enough, the way that the classification systems work is that if you inadvertently become in possession of information that's classified above your clearance rank, then that's a crime, even if it's inadvertent. If you are doing a penetration test, you gain possession of information you're not supposed to have, then that could be considered a crime, which apparently leads to a lot of underutilization of penetration testing techniques in U.S. military and intelligence settings. So whether you come down on the patriot or the traitor side of the argument, and there's certainly a lot of debate here in the United States as to where these two fellows fall. Obviously, the thing with Manning is a little bit more settled at this point. He's in prison and will likely be there for a very long time. And, of course, if Snowden came back, it's almost certain that he would end up in prison and be there for a very long time, because what they did was clearly violated their obligations. Now, whether you say that this is sort of a Nuremberg thing where they had a higher obligation and they carried it out, some people feel that way, some people don't. But obviously the impact on national security and U.S. prestige in the world has been profound based on these two incidents. Now, the number one bug that I'm going to highlight here is the Healthcare.gov, just because it's so topical, really. It remains to be seen what really will end up happening. Obviously, the initial launch of this website has been, I think it's very charitable to say that it's gone very poorly. The first layer of the onion were all the performance problems associated with it, and then it comes to light that there are all sorts of security issues with personal data, which I believe remain unfixed. And now the next thing, and not surprisingly, is that it's not integrating properly with various insurance companies. And data is being sent that can't be processed by the insurance companies. People are assuming that they have policies when they don't. So quite the mess. Part of this had its origins in some political decisions that firm commitments as to how the system was to work were postponed until after November 2012, so as to avoid any possibility, in fact, it would have really been a certainty, that information would have been leaked out into the Romney campaign and used against the Obama campaign. So there's a certain element of a self-inflicted wound here that all of these problems have a strong, a major factor in this situation is that there were political decisions that were made, which now the fact that the system is having all these problems, it was sort of a pain now or much more pain later. There's been a lot of discussion that the contractors right before the launch knew that testing hadn't been adequate. The qualifications of the people doing the testing were apparently fairly limited, but even so, they managed to find a lot of problems. And as I said, it remains to be seen how significant this will be over the long term. This is a very polarized situation here in the United States, and you've got probably, about a quarter of the people who are desperately hoping that all of this is going to get cleared up and be fine in the next few months, and then another quarter of the people are hoping that, paraphrase Lenin's comment, actually quote Lenin's comment about the events right immediately prior to the Russian Communist Revolution, the worse the better, what he said about Kerensky's regime. In other words, the worse things get, the better it is for us, and that would be the people on the other side, about a quarter of them. And then there's probably about 50% of people who are sort of in the middle going, I don't know how to make any sense out of this, but I sure hope my individual healthcare doesn't get impacted by this nonsense. Healthcare is a huge part of the United States economy. So, the United States economy makes up about 25% of the world's GDP. And so 1/6 of the U.S. economy is healthcare. So this is around 5% of the world's gross domestic product here that we're talking about, and not an insignificant amount of money at all. If the United States healthcare system, from an economic point of view, more or less collapsed, this could have some exceptionally profound impacts. They're difficult to foresee. So here we are, 2014. Software is more successful in some ways than ever. It's everywhere, but we still don't have the bug situation under control. The software, hardware systems have bugs. Most of the time, the bugs, they're just a hassle. So, for example, I've been spending the last few days setting up a new PC, and fortunately, I only have to do this every 3 or 4 years, and that gives me a long enough time to forget what a painful exercise this is. And a lot of it is just because stuff that ought to work doesn't work. I plug the phone into the computer, it doesn't sync up, it doesn't recognize the phone at first. It takes 3 tries to download your drivers before the operating system realizes, oh, you have that turned off, and then I have to turn it on. Oh, it took me, I didn't work on this for 8 hours, but it was a space of 8 hours before I was able to get the simplest thing to happen, which was just copying stuff from my PC onto my phone. So that's annoying, and it wastes my time. I've got better things to do with my time. But the real issue is when things get really expensive, or they get dangerous, people actually get hurt, killed, or just put into hazard. Or they create political problems. There's certainly other instances that we could have talked about. I picked 10, not exactly out of a hat, but it wasn't a big process. I just went through and said, except for the one case of the car that risked the life of my family, criteria were pretty simple. $1 million or more in losses, or somebody died, or both. I probably could have come up with a completely different list of 10, maybe 3 or 4 times. So the problem is only going to get worse before it gets better. The more and more ubiquitous systems are, the more it is that every time there's a defect that escapes, and so many of them do, that people's lives are at risk. So, cautionary tale to kick off 2014. We need to think about what to do about bugs. Okay, so I'm going to put the advertisement up here, and I'm going to undock the question. Question panel here. We've got a question from Robin. So, Robin, good to hear from you. And yes, I owe you a call. I will get in touch with you tomorrow. You said, did you run that bit about penetration testers who accidentally get access being a crime by James Nazar? He worked that gig later than I did, but when I was a penetration tester, we never heard any such thing. Now that's interesting then, Robin, because this I'd heard from one of the folks in the team there who was saying that there were potential legal issues associated with getting a hold of information. I could have been misinformed, or I could have simply misunderstood what I was being told. Nonetheless, even if this isn't an issue of inadequate penetration testing being done, it is an issue of inadequate security settings on these systems, because it there are ways of configuring systems such that there has to be dual authentication associated with getting access to this information. And especially for a private, I understand how a system administrator, who part of what they're going to know is kind of how to get around these things. It's kind of the Snowden thing is a little bit easier for me to understand. I know the kind of power that a system administrator tends to have. It's tough to put limits on that. But the thing with Manning is more impenetrable to me. How somebody gets all of that data and burns it onto a Lady Gaga CD or something absurd like that, and then walks out with it. It's somewhat mind-boggling as to the absence of security to catch them. And not to say that the industry necessarily does any better. So I'm not saying this is a shame on the government thing at all. This is just we all need to do a better job of securing information. So an interesting question from Bybov. Should testers be more skilled, technically domain-wise, in testing as compared to developers? Well, I think it depends. Obviously, obviously every tester should know a lot more about testing than any developer, right? And this is where I kind of get my drawers in a wad with some of the commentary by certain people in the Agile community. I'm not going to say all, but if you read, for example, Schwaber's books on Scrum, and he's kind of somewhat dismissive, I think, towards the idea of professional testers. And I think part of the reason that we have some of the problems that we do in software engineering is we don't have enough professionalism, including amongst testers. So we need more specialization, not less. So yeah, I definitely want testers to have more testing skills, which is why I've invested tremendous amounts of my own non-existent free time on the ISTQB program. In terms of domain or technical knowledge, this is really kind of application specific. So we have a client that does geological modeling software for oil companies. If you're familiar with the way this works, you're doing oil exploration. You're basically setting off explosions near what you consider to be promising and interesting geological formations, and then tracking the waves. The sound wave isn't the right word, and shock wave doesn't seem like it's quite the right word either, but it's basically there's going to be undulations that are going to move through the material underground, and they move through rock at a different rate than they move through oil. And they also move through water at a different rate than they move through oil, and they move through salt water at a different rate than they do through fresh water, at least in different ways. And so this is a tremendously complicated thing, and to be able to read the outputs of these applications and be able to say, oh, yeah, okay, that looks like that's a large oil deposit, you can't just learn that overnight. As my client there said, the director of testing, he said, I can teach people what I need them to know about testing, but I can't teach them what they need to know about the oil business to understand how this application works. So I'm not hiring anybody who doesn't have some kind of chemical engineering or petroleum engineering degree. They have to be able to sit down in front of this thing and figure out how to think like an oil analyst. So, in some cases, yes, domain expertise is really critical. In other cases, it's not critical. In fact, it might be non-existent. If you're testing an application that's designed to be used by novice users, I'm not going to say that there's a problem with having people who have a lot of expertise, but in that case, since I've managed this before, you have to constantly reinforce with the testers, look, you are not the target customer here. You have to try to think like the target user, the target customer. So it really is, I think, in many ways, a case-by-case situation. You need to figure out what skills are needed and hire accordingly. But certainly testing, yes. I mean, we always want testers to be test experts, and I think it's just it is not a good thing for testing as a profession or for software engineering as a whole to have the specialized skill of testers being denigrated or deprecated. Rajesh asks, does having any of the projects listed in your list in the resume affect the career prospects of the tester? Well, you notice that I talked about a couple of them that I was involved in, and none didn't have any long-term effect in the sense of, damaging career prospects. I think, oddly enough, how exactly to say this? I'm just going to say this, and it's probably not going to come out exactly right, but one of the most educational experiences that you as a tester can ever go through is a large-scale failed project. Working on a large-scale project is very different than working on small-scale projects. Seven or eight people assembling an e-commerce application in 3 months bears no relationship, other than the most rudimentary technological ones, to working with a team that is 100+ people, possibly geographically distributed, on a project that is going to last for years. The level of complexity is so different, and the kinds of things that can go wrong, and the difficulty of recovering from earlier bad decisions is so different that it really will change your thinking forever when you've worked on a few projects like that. So you do want to see, you want, as a tester, I think it's beneficial to work on the small, simple stuff, absolutely, because you need to gain an understanding that the world is not always large and complex, and it doesn't always need the kind of formality and risk management and rigor that you need on the large and complex stuff. But you also have to be aware that there is this world where things are large and complex, and if you do not tackle that with a very different mindset and a very different level of rigor, you will encounter problems. When I say you here, I'm talking about the project team. As a tester, you're going to be somewhat insulated from it. Your job is to provide information, and you can do that. The people that really, bear the impact of the large failed project is project managers and program managers and so forth. And that too will be a education to you, Rajesh, if you're on a large project, is where you see what happens to people psychologically and behaviorally when something large, complicated, and extremely expensive that they've dedicated large amounts of their time to starts to collapse, especially when it's people who are actually going to be held accountable for it, like project managers and program managers. I've seen some very interesting dysfunctional behavior break out in these situations as people start to realize, oh my God, we're doomed. So it's a test of your mettle. Oh, so Rajesh got a follow-up here. He says, one of my friends works on the Healthcare.gov project. He is looking out for a change now, and whenever he applies, this is the first question he's being asked, why did it go wrong? Oh, I don't doubt that. I don't, yeah. I mean, and he obviously is going to need to be able to provide a cogent explanation to that, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for him to be able to say, I learned something from watching this. And I can help you avoid something similar, because This is what I meant when I said, if you're in the middle of one of these things, it will be one of the most educational experiences of your life. It will not necessarily be fun. The project that I mentioned right at the outset was, I can't think of any project that I learned more from, but I also can't think of a project where I would be less happy to go back and relive the last 6 months of my life on that project. Because it was an exceptionally painful experience. There was nothing but surprises every other day, and all of the surprises were bad. Now, of course, if I got to do it over again, they'd be less surprising to me. But I would not willingly go through that learning experience again. And I think that's probably what the interviewers are looking for here is what. Having been involved in such a massive failure, what insights has this person taken away from it? I know I would be asking that same question. I wouldn't be asking it from the point of view of how is it your fault and why shouldn't I hire you? I'd be asking it from a very different point of view of you tell me explain to me all the wisdom that you gained from seeing this disaster firsthand. And yes, I would be watching very carefully for the signs that person had taken the right lessons away. The rest says, thank you very much. Your reasoning was very helpful. Well, thank you for the excellent questions. I always enjoy good, thought-provoking questions, and these webinars are always an opportunity to address such questions. You have very, very smart people listening to these things, which is a lot of fun. Okay, well, that runs us through our questions. So to close the session out, a little bit more about the resources that are available. We do run these free webinar sessions once a month, so do check our website, rbcs-us.com, to sign up. If you want a special webinar presentation for your company only, this webinar or any other topic related to software testing, please contact us at info@rbcs-us.com or via our website. You can also sign up for our free newsletter at our website. This will get you discounts on consulting and training services, and a regular newsletter includes a featured article on software testing and quality and news about what we are up to lately. You can follow us on Twitter. That's at RBCS, and we're also on Facebook, RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your email over the next couple of days. You might be the lucky winner of a free e-learning course. You will register simply by attending. Check out our digital library. You've got recordings of these webinars along with other videos out there. You can subscribe to our podcasts of these webinars using either iTunes or by the RSS feed on our webpage. And we are also on YouTube as RBCS channel that you can subscribe to. We offer these free resources as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not just-for-profit company. This concludes the webinar. I thank everyone for joining us today.